communism was the brutal truth of life in the Soviet Union and those places, before unions were associated with corruption and Jimmy Hoffa and things like that. I wanted to write about that period. I had known about the industrial workers of the world and what happened in 1909 in Spokane since my days at the newspaper. I used to just go haunt the morgue, which was the files of all the old stories, and I would just read things as a novelist would. And I don't know that I was looking for Tom Foley's file when I came across Elizabeth Gurley Flynn's, but I did cover Foley's last election, so it would explain why I was in the F's, but I remember coming across that. So those two little pieces started to come together. I'd never written a Western. I wanted to write something with big archetypal characters, but in my way, I didn't want to write a classic Western. I wanted to write something at the end of the Western period. So that was kind of the third thing. And then I'll show you the fourth thing. It was this postcard of 1910 Spokane.
Yeah.
The amazing crowds on the street, the horses, the streetcars, just some of these figures struck me like, that guy, what's he doing? And I started thinking about just how thriving my city was then, and I wanted to write about it then. All of those things, kind of come together into this big snowball, and you find yourself writing a labor Western from, that covers 100 years in your city's history, So my process can be kind of unwieldy that way, the same way I'll sit and think, Italy, Hollywood, the Donner Party, I'll write a novel about that, So, but that was kind of the path that I traced, was, and I think another part of it was my kids who are now between 20 and 35, and talking to them about activism and politics and hopelessness, and looking back in history for a moment when you might have felt similarly hopeless about certain things, whether politically or socially, and then I'm always drawn to the idea of making people look at lives of poverty and seeing them in a different way. My grandfather had told me stories of being a hobo riding rails, and I was such a fan of pirate books, especially Treasure Island, that to me jumping on a train sounded like stowing away on a pirate ship. And so to create a life of adventure and then have you realize the next time you see a homeless person that you might be looking at a ride Dolan, who might be on the street not because of an addiction, which a lot of people are, or mental illness, which unfortunately a lot of people are, but because he was born into the wrong family, which also some people are. So I think all those things kind of cohere until, and then you have to try to match all those impulses in the book that you've written, or try to.
Well, you did an excellent job of doing that.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah. Sometimes I always feel like I'm being called in front of congressional testimony to explain how I've written the novel I have, well, then this happened and then that happened. And there's always a moment, I think every novelist will tell you, of kind of terror. Think, wait a minute, am I really writing a labor Western, a labor feminist Western, set in 1909, and you'll think, yeah, I guess that's what that's the bark I've bitten off. Oh, I may have there. Sorry.
Yes, I wanted to ask you and everybody.
Other questions? I
had someone ask if they could record, and I started a recorder. But since I didn't ask everybody because some people don't want to be seen. And is it okay does anyone have objections to the recording?
No.
Okay, I won't worry about it then. Anyway, so please go on. I'm kind of curious. I know that you have an extensive background with journalism, and when did you decide to start writing novels that were not nonfiction? Because I know some of your things in the beginning were sort of results of a lot of journalistic research, but you've made such a good job. But now you're combining them, so it's kind of neat.
Yeah, I think I wanted to be a novelist well before I wanted to be a journalist. And I don't know that I separated them. I mean, I certainly did when I was a reporter. I did not write fiction intentionally, I promise. But I, yeah, I'm a first generation college student, first male in my family to finish high school. So I didn't really know how to become a novelist. And so for me, journalism was a really, I was also a teenage father. So for me, journalism was a way to learn being a writer. I was not going to be able to afford to go get my master's of fine arts somewhere. And so, for me, that was just the path I took to becoming a writer. But I loved writing everything. I wrote, I've told the story before, my sister and brother and I started a family magazine called Readers Indigestion when I was 7 or 8. And even though my sister was older, I was the editor because I was a little bit bossy when it came to writing. So I always wanted to be some kind of writer. And when I was a kid, there wasn't a library that I went to that I didn't go see where my books would go one day. So I sort of always assumed that would be the case. And it was probably my early 20s before I realized just how impossible that was. And in my journalism career, there was a period where I chalked that up to the same dream I had to be an NBA point guard, that it probably wasn't going to happen. And so, but I kept, I kept reading and writing fiction on the weekends, even as a journalist, as if, because it was my love. But I didn't really think of it as a career. I thought of it more like my religion, that I would be a fiction writer the way someone was a Methodist or an optimist, or, that it would just be part of my personality. And I think that served me well because I wrote a lot before anybody cared. And and I think I was able to build my chops that way. As far as research and journalism making its way back in, I think I've always, seen the world as a journalist. Even 1909, I was drawn to it by its parallels to today. And so that in many ways, The Financial Lives of the Poets is about the economic crisis of 2008. The Zero is about 9/11. I think Citizen Vince is based on reporting I did on the witness protection program. So I think I've always sort of combined my desire as a journalist to tell you what's going on in the world now with my desire to write fiction.
I was initially having a little trouble wondering where you were going with the story and trying to figure out the characters, like Ryan and Gig but I'll tell you what pulled it together for me when you had the monologues and you had the individual characters talk in their own personality. And boy, and what you did too with that, you kept it, you didn't let that be static. You seemed to keep that developing. And that was kind of the undertone all the way through for the rest of the book. And that really captured my attention, the way you developed the characters.
Alongside the external plot of a novel for me is a kind of interior architecture. And most of you have seen the cover, which features the falls and the river. And the river was always the central motif of the story for me. I wanted to tell a story that felt like the river coming through my town. And those first person stories I wanted you to think of as tributaries or undercurrents or coming in. And so you'll see that I had them put these
graphic.
The little graphic. Every chapter that has one of those characters will have that. The chapters that are third person, that are Ryan Gig, are just numbered. And then if a character dies in that scene, which happens often, then you get the date in that scene too. So that very much for me was the sort of motif I wanted. I wanted you to feel like the kid, as if you were on this river sort of coming along, and in comes this other story, and I also realized, you know what, that I was writing a story in which my protagonist, Rye, was not necessarily the hero of the story. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn was more the hero, or possibly even Gig. These people who, you know, whose actions were so much bigger. And and I did that intentionally. I wanted Rye to be almost the field upon which this is played. He's someone who starts out as a hobo, and then through, you know, the sacrifices of others, ends up with a good job, and this place in the American tapestry that he wants, ends up part of the middle class that my family aspired to. And so in doing that, I wanted to be able to bring those more dynamic voices in. Think of a novel like The Great Gatsby. Nick is the one telling you the story, but he isn't the big character of the novel. And so I wanted to be able to bring those big characters in. And frankly, for me, they're just so fun to write. I never had more fun than writing Ursula the Great, or Del Dalvo and his hatred of Spokane, you know, that the place gave him the morbs. And there was a moment when I realized that everyone that I'm writing about in 1909 has passed away. And I felt almost like I was writing about these ghosts. And I knew it would be a violent book, in part because of the violence of the period and because I wanted to write a kind of Western. But I could think of nothing more intimate than to write that violence all the way through the last moments of these characters' lives. And it seemed to me like a way to kind of make the violence not cartoonish, but, you know, have it, you know, give it the gravity that I felt like it deserved, but also something I hadn't seen before. A lot of times I'm just, you know, giving myself writing challenges that kind of keep me engaged with the page. So, yeah.
I think Maureen has a question.
Yes.
Oh, I do. Hi, my name is Maureen Green, and I enjoyed your book.
Hand up. I learn things about Zoom all the time. That's great.
Oh, yes, down with the hand. Anyway, I'd like to lower hand. Okay.
Yeah.
So I have grown up being told that my great-great-grandfather was a Pinkerton detective.
Uh-huh.
And I held my grandfather in esteem, so I naturally held my great-grandfather in esteem until I read your book. And now I'm beginning to wonder, what is the true story about Pinkerton detectives? And was Early Rustin, was he supposed to be a Pinkerton?
Well, Early is an interesting character. There's a real historical figure named Harry Orchard, who was involved in the bombing of the former Idaho governor, and he played both sides. He would be whoever he said he had to be to kill whoever he had to kill and get whatever money. And so I sort of thought of Early less as any one specific thing than as a sort of embodiment of the violence of the time. So people are often surprised that I don't know the answer to some questions about my own characters, that I allow them to have a kind of enigmatic existence. So one of the questions I get the most often is about my novel, Citizen Vince. And they say, who did Vince vote for? And I always say, I turned my back. I let him vote. You know, I mean, that's private. I'm not going to look over his shoulder while he votes. And people are always sort of mystified by that. But I felt sort of the same way about Early, that I was going to make his past so enigmatic that even I wouldn't necessarily be sure of it. I would have an opinion, but I wouldn't answer those questions. As to the Pinkertons themselves, it's a pretty complex question. They show up at different historical moments. During the Civil War, I think you could say that the Pinkertons were nothing but heroic, because, you know, they worked against the South and slavery. They rooted out spies, Southern spies in the North. When they infiltrated groups like the Molly Maguires, it's a little dicier. You know, they often were the ones pushing for the violence they would then bring forward. One of the reasons I wanted to write about Pinkertons was, you know, because one of my heroes, Dashiell Hammett, the the author of so many great novels, was a Pinkerton stationed in Spokane, and he used that to write his novel Red Harvest. He lived in Spokane and would go to Montana to investigate, labor people. There's a great book called Big Trouble by J. Anthony Lucas, which really shows you the fullness of the Pinkerton story. But certainly in the early 1900s, oh, there it is, yeah. Certainly in the early 1900s, the main job of the Pinkertons was to infiltrate unions, to bust up unions. If you saw socialism and communism as huge dangers to the country, you also saw them trying to keep socialists and anarchists at bay. And there were some Pinkertons especially who would go off the books and take these really difficult jobs. These, that have this sort of sleazier side of private detection. But by no means is this, meant to say that all Pinkertons did that. I purposely wanted to write a really sort of a character who was who had lost his way. There's another Pinkerton in the novel Willard, who ends up, a former Pinkerton, who ends up, really being Rye's close ally, and I think has this kind of honor, And so I think I do think the job by 1909 had a certain corruption about it, because they were working for, mining companies and steel companies that were trying to keep workers from, if you look at what happened at the Homestead Steel Strike, for instance, where workers were killed, Pinkerton agents often would sort of go inside, rile them up, and then report the people that they'd riled up. But it is a complex question, and I still hold, is it your great grandfather you said?
Yes, and he would have been 1800s, so I feel a little better.
Yeah, no, I hold him in only the highest esteem, and
Thank you.
And they are sort of the they are the modern, they are the precursor of what we think of as the modern detective, because as I say in the book, you didn't go to the police to solve a crime. You went to the police to knock a drunk out of your place, and they did solve some crimes, the Spokane police, but it was what happens when law enforcement becomes privatized. You can hire those people, to find your missing daughter. You can also hire them to keep workers from, demanding that you not employ 9-year-olds. And, I think one is a little more honorable than the other, but if you're going to run that business, you're probably going to take both those jobs sometimes.
So the integrity of the job is attached to whoever has hired them. The nature of it comes with that.
I think it was also just endemic of the end of the last Gilded Age. At that moment, the wealth was so divided between these wealthy magnates and everyone else. Kind of much the way it is now. Those mercenary companies that took work in Afghanistan and BlackRock and some of those, is it called BlackRock? That they were doing a similar job. It's a sort of privatized military that, if I'm working for an oil company in Iraq and in 2006, I probably want private security to work for me too, and so, that when you write a novel, you definitely take a certain point of view that you're, but I also try to create characters with depth too. And, writing Del Dalvo's sections, as I said, was great fun, because I did imagine I was writing kind of the missing link between cowboys and detectives, between Western literature and that kind of, detective literature. And so he was a great missing link, and it was another character that I felt sort of honored writing to his death, and that in that moment when he thinks about his daughter and his grandson, but then there's this lovely character moment when he says, my grandson, who's 4 or 8, and I love that he has that that he knows he's some age like that, but you know, he hasn't maybe been the best grandfather, that he's thinking about his grandson whose age he can only narrow to about 4 years. Yeah.
Thank you.
Looks like a real hand up there.
Oh, Jess, any subplots or characters you thought of including and then decided not to?
Yeah, there were quite a few actually. And some that I took out. You know, I mentioned Elizabeth Gurley Flynn sort of being the instigator of the novel, and I had quite a bit more of her in the novel, including, you know, some flashbacks of her earlier years and things. There was a jewelry robber in downtown, working in downtown Spokane at the time, that I'd made notes on, that I thought forever would be part of the novel, and had to sort of, you know, take out. I debated whether or not to put the story of the kid in there, the guy who rides the stolen ferry from Plants Ferry to the falls. In the end, I decided to, because I really wanted the novel to cover 100 years, 1864, before the city even existed, to 1964. I wanted that sense of pulling back so that you can see, even though this feels like such long ago history, an entire city was born in the period in which you've read the novel. A full city, you know, takes shape. And so but I had a few other little bits and pieces that I wrote sort of along the lines of that, that I thought might make their way in. You know, I know sometimes that readers want a more direct line, but I love taking a little side trip like that. I think from some of my earliest novels, you know, I remember one of my editors saying, do we really need to go into the points of view of Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan? And I'm like, we do. And, you know, and then an editor saying, you know, I'm not sure about this pitch for the Donner Party movie. And I responded by making it twice as long and sending it back. And so I tend to like that. I tend to like drifting out into something and then coming back. But I don't want to waste the reader's time either. And so some of those things I just didn't have, I could not think of how the jewelry thief would fit in. It didn't feel like it should be early rest, and by that point of the novel, I really felt the pull of bringing these characters to the places they had to go.
Jack has a question up there.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm 82 years old, been here all my life. And I was a railroader.
Oh,
And
right.
I'm very interested in the historicity of Spokane because of living here 82 years. And my best friend is Paul Dorpat, kind of the resident historian of Seattle,
Mhm.
and now and then type stuff. And so I was very interested in the flow of the book because of my union experience. I was local chairman. I was also president of the local union, and it was very, very interesting to me because it just flowed good for my life.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that. Yeah, like I said, you know, one thing I wanted to honor. So my dad now has Alzheimer's, and so he and I have had that, you know, that really long goodbye that you get with an Alzheimer's patient. And my dad was not a fiction reader at all. He had just never been raised to read novels, and so he would say, I don't know who's talking, I don't know what's happening, you know. And I would just say, well, just let it flow over you and see what happens. I would give him audiobooks. He really liked my nonfiction, but so I kept telling him, Dad, this is a book I think you'd like. I think you'd like this one, you know. And I joked with him when I brought him a copy. I said, I'm sorry I brought this to you when it's too late for you to read. And he leaned forward and said, I never liked reading anyway. So he broke it to me. But yeah, it was, I appreciate that. You know, when my dad took a job at Kaiser, 1 in 3 Americans worked for a union. Now that number is less than 1 in 10.
Yeah.
And I totally understand, you know, there were, you know, you could not watch, you know, what happened with a union like the Teamsters, and you know, and think that they were all good, of course. But you know, in throwing out babies with bathwaters, I think, you know, and in looking what happened to the American middle class and why it shrinks all the time, and why we have the same economic inequality between the top and the bottom that we had in 1909. One thing I think you have to look at is what happened to you know, to labor unions, and you know, and just the way people will demonize, you know, teachers unions, for instance. You know, so writing about early labor was a time, like I said, to really write about the idealism of it, and not get caught up in, you know, in politics, because I think novels can really bog down if they become, you know, too political. So to make an adventure story in which, you know, it's really hard to argue that you should have to pay $1 to get a job that's going to get yanked out from under you. You know, it was a pretty easy way to sort of talk generally about you know, fighting for the rights of workers. But thank you. I one of the things that was the most terrifying for me is when you're writing a novel set in 1909, you have, you know, you have people traveling by train. I thought some railroad people are going to come and tell me, you could not have caught a train from here to there, you know, or it would have taken this much longer. And so I was, you know, and I was really careful in a lot of ways with research. And then the fiction writer just always takes over. And I say, you know what? I'm going to say you could get from Wallace to Taft by train. And if someone tells me no, I'll just go fiction. So for the unreliable narrator, this is the unreliable author. So various times I throw out the researcher, I hand him his walking paper, tell him his service will no longer be required. Jess Walter novel included.
Sure.
Yes.
Maureen, you have your hand up and you're muted, so you need to unmute if you want to see your.
Okay, and I don't mean to hog it. So
Okay.
so I just have two questions, and it kind of has to do with Rye. And you mentioned Kaiser. You kind of made a connection between Rye's machine shop you worked for, was it, and how it eventually became Kaiser?
No,
There was some
I think
connection.
machine shop sells.
Did I
and
get
then
that
he
wrong?
Yeah, I think he
Co-workers.
just. Yeah, I think he gets a job at Kaiser during the beginning of World War II when it World War II when it ramps up. And my dad went to work at Kaiser in 1964, the year that I land Rye, and the year before I landed on the planet. So it felt like this really nice kind of symmetry, you know, to have him and his career at the time my dad was starting there.
Then I had one other thing. It had to do with Rye and the $5,000. And I just wondered, was that a little bit of a struggle trying to determine what he eventually did with it? You know, I think he eventually ended up giving 3,000 to Salvation Army.
Yeah.
I was curious about that
Yeah.
process for you.
You know, it's I don't plan entirely where a book is going, and so when I got to that point, by then I know the characters so well that I feel like I'm writing in a kind of I'm writing in a way that sort of surprises me. And so, you know, I thought, oh, what if Willard comes back for some of the money? And Willard's kind of embarrassed to have to ask. And, you know, I think what he's seen with Rye has kind of opened up his heart in a way to maybe the kind of man he always wanted to be, but he's also always lost his employer. He's fallen on hard times. And so that sort of debate about them taking the money I really liked. And then of course he goes and pays his union dues. And then I got to the scene with Ursula the Great, and I loved that she was the only one who wouldn't take a dime, you know, and it just underlined for me something about her character. And again, I'm writing and I'm like, oh, she's not taking the money. Oh, how great, you know, and those are the real kind of joys of writing. And then I was just sort of like Rye. I'm like, crap, he's got $3,000 in his pocket. He's walking down the street. Oh, look, you know, there's a charity. There's a place for him to give the money to honor the place he came from, you know. And so I wanted it to be a small gesture. I didn't want it to be some big over the top thing, almost the way I was writing it, almost like, what do I do? You know, what do I do with the rest of this money? And, you know, those character surprises, like finding out Rye was a clothes horse, really surprised me, you know, that he was a man who appreciated a good suit and a pair of gloves. And so for a moment he flashes on, I could just go in and slap this down on the counter and say, you know, give me $3,000 worth of nice clothes. But I think it's a moment for, you know, someone who's not going to devote his life to a cause the way Elizabeth Gurley Flynn is, or his brother would have, to honor what's happened. That this has been about something, which is bringing other people up, and something that the Salvation Army can help do. I think it was Marge had it. Yeah, I saw her raising her hand too. But
Mark, did you have a
Marge, you're muted.
Marge, you're muted, so yeah.
Am I unmuted now?
now you're better.
Can you hear you?
Yeah.
Okay. I just wanted to say that when I got your book, and I'm the oldest one in this group, I stayed up until 4 a.m. in the morning to finish it.
Oh, wow.
I did like it. I haven't done that for many, many years. But anyway, you talked about the river in the beginning, and that grabbed me right from the beginning, that the river became such an important part of the story. And also, I wanted to ask you a little bit about your inclusion of War and Peace. I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah.
And then your quote from War and Peace towards the end of the novel. I haven't read War and Peace. I will say I've read Anna Karenina, but that was very interesting to me.
Oh, thank you.
And
I love it.
I thought all of your characters were just wonderful. Jules and, you know, just the whole bunch. I really enjoyed the book. But so there were many, many things we could talk about.
Well, I'll talk about those two real quickly. First of all, I love that you love Anna Karenina. I had to have Rye's daughter make that same point, that she prefers that novel.
I saw that, and
yeah, because I sort of do too. War and Peace is an unbelievable book, and it did feel like it was this interconnected thing about living through a certain moment in history. That, of course, is about Napoleon's attempt to invade Russia, which is a much larger moment. But for Rye to read a book in which people are being swept along, again, to that river metaphor, by the flow of history, you know, you're pulled along. And so, and as far as the river, yeah, it was, you know, it is the central metaphor of this place, and it speaks to both the way, you know, the city was settled, but, you know, coming across those old photos of the trap doors where they would dump garbage in the center of the river, and, you know, and reading an actual description of them dynamiting below the falls to just send all the crap downstream, you know, it's really, you know, I think a lot of history is honoring like the founders of a place, but you also have to be honest about, you know, and reconcile the things that are less, you know, honorable about a place. And the way the river was treated, I'm such a proud member of the River Keeper organization here, and donate my time and effort to it, because it really is this gem of why the city is here. And so yeah, it really felt like, you know, and I have always lived along the river. I live on Summit Boulevard, just over the river now, so I can look out my window and see it. And grew up in the valley just across the river from Riblett's mansion, right on the river there. I've never, since I've lived in Spokane, I've never lived more than really about a mile from the river. And so I can't imagine how many hundreds of walks, thousands of walks I've taken. In every novel, you know, there's a point where I get stuck and I have to walk along the river and kind of let it loose my feelings. So it was great to be able to include that, you know, in the tapestry of the book. So thank you so much. And I love all those books behind you. That's
Oh.
how you zoom with an author. Not that the rest of you shouldn't, but
Yeah.
but those bookshelves are
I'm a
pretty.
bookstore, believe me.
Yeah, and thank you for staying up till 4 in the morning.
I didn't
had
believe
so-
I could do that and actually remember what I read.
yeah, I've had so many book hangovers that to cause one in someone else is the best feeling. So thank you.
Jess,
Yeah.
unlike Marge, I would allot so many pages to read each day, but as I got more and more into the book, I was going well beyond my allotted pages to read each day. But I stopped knowing that the next time I sat down to pick up the book to read it, I would finish it. And so I started doing that, read a page and a half, and got to the explosion of the car. And I thought, I can't believe I missed this yesterday. I would have finished the book the day before had I let myself go that extra page and a half. But the way that Gig took care of Rye by not letting Early hand off the bond to him, I just thought he really was a hero.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a moment where Ursula says to Rye, he's been taking care, your brother's been taking care of you this whole time. He said, no, I've been taking care of my brother. And and she says, and imagine how that feels to him. She knows that, Gig knows that he's headed for probably a life like their father's. He doesn't control his appetites very well. And so I think in that moment, it's the realization of what Ursula told Rye, that this kid can make it. Rye is a worker. He belongs in this society that he and I live on the outside of. I don't necessarily, and so that, you're writing about unions, you're writing about what we used to call brotherhood, which is a bit of a chauvinistic way to describe, humanhood, I guess. But there's another kind of brotherhood that, Rye and Gig have, that deep affection for each other that also is half irritation and half responsibility. And I'm an older brother myself, and so I knew at that point that if I could make the action match what I felt like the characters were feeling, that it would feel right, And I felt like at that moment, Gig thought, oh, if he goes with me, we're going to end up in another, hobo camp. We're going to end up, kind of a life outside the civilization. And if there's one thing Rye wanted, it was to be inside. He wanted to be in Mrs. Ricci's house. He wanted to be in his own house. He wanted to belong, and that realization about your brother and then doing something selfless, struck me as kind of if I could pull it off. You're always writing thinking, I hope I can pull this off. So.
We've got about 10 minutes and we do have some folks we've not heard from. And
Yeah.
Leanne, you've got your hand up, so.
I do, and it's about Early. You make it somewhat ambiguous as far as what happens when the car crashes, and there had to be something that prompted you to do that. What was that?
Well, I talk about the death of John Sullivan, which was never solved, was kind of solved, but there was this Victor Claude Miller character who his wife killed him, and then he told investigators, he said he killed the cop up in Spokane or Seattle or Oregon or something, and they're like, solved, and again, I wanted the haziness of mystery to still exist around those things and those characters. There's a moment where Rye and Willard talk about it, and and Lem Brand is haunted by the idea that Early might still be out there, that this killer might be out there. So again, I didn't mind him being this mysterious figure that you don't know if he lived or died. And again, when people ask me, I will plead the fifth and pretend I don't know. In my view of the world, he died in the car accident. They went off the cliff. It'd be a really impossible thing to get away from. But I don't mind the idea that that there's that ambivalence or that lack of clarity around it, because it's in a way not what the novel's about. The novel's about that brotherhood and the sacrifice of Elizabeth Gurley Flynn and Rye and Gig, and and about wanting to belong. So
it'll be a good connection to the second movie.
yeah. I'm sure in about 13 minutes they'll say, what if Hurley survives, and then season 2. So yeah. And I will say, I don't believe any of this. Send me a check, sure.
Might not see your arm.
Oh, I know.
How about you,
Yes.
Patty? Did you have a comment or question?
Your arm.
It was, of course, a wonderful book. I live in an, excuse me, in a 1910 house.
I see the woodwork. I recognize it anywhere.
Yes, and you start the novel basically in our alley. I
Oh,
live
yeah.
at 9th and Madison, so I'm right there.
Yeah.
And it was wonderful living in a house like that. I live in the Comstock Shadle House, which is the Crescent department store.
Yeah.
So, and I wonder, because the house is such a part of Spokane, and Crescent was such a part of Spokane's history. And, I walk around, in the house wondering about that moment in time. I mean, it was built in 1910. They lived in it in 1910. And it was wonderful to read the book and be in that moment when they were building the house and moving into, the house that I now live in. So for me personally, it was a wonderful little snapshot.
I have lived in 3 houses. I've owned 3 houses in Spokane, and every one of them was built between 1906 and 1909. So, and I'm in a carriage house above my garage, a rock carriage house from 1909 now. So, it's one of the things I loved about researching this book, was just walking through the neighborhoods. I walked Waterbury's beat, because that actually happened. That police officer was really shot a few days before the free speech riots. And so, it was amazing to walk by John Sullivan's house and to walk through all these places. It really did make, when you're writing the novel, it really makes it come alive. You do then, as I said, venture away from the real story. So it looked like Janet had a question there.
Did you ever work in the Carnegie Library? Jack proposed to me while I was working there. So I was excited to see the Carnegie in there.
Yeah, I love that. I love that library, and I love libraries, and it's one of the motifs that runs through the book too. Rye has that first epiphany when he's in the library of Lembrand, of course, with all those books that have never been opened, and it breaks his heart that all his brother, finding out that there was a great hobo library, that these transients would trade books, was, as someone who loves books, that was one of the most deepest character moments. And so I wanted these other moments to come up around books, around War and Peace. And so when he gets to the Carnegie Library, it's one of only 2 times that Rye is really treated like a human being. The other is when he goes to buy those gloves, and he gets to know the clothing salesman. But the way the librarian treats him and just says, "Come here, I want to show you something," then slides his books off. And so I had never, the Carnegie Library was no longer a library by the time I came of age, but I looked at a whole bunch of old photos, and the big windows and the lighted, the light on the tables, and and to me that's one of my favorite moments in the book, is when he just, and he slides out those, and he makes the joke about a book translated into from Russian into French into English is like reading a rumor, and Ryan laughs like, okay, if you say so, so yeah.
Great.
Thank
How about you, Mary? Mary gets a chance.
Looks like Mary, yeah.
Hi there. I would love to take a walking tour of Spokane with you because I have such curiosity. And my era had to do with Expo 74. And I remember very, very distinctly how we just had to clean up those terrible railroad lines that had run through the middle of our town. And I just thought, how much of that really dictated the nature of the town versus the river itself?
Yeah, I mean, it was both. I mean, the river is what started. I tell people to think of the railroad as the internet. The 1909 railroad is connecting the world in a way in the late 1800s, it's connecting the world in a way it's never been connected. As Rod says, all of a sudden the world is one place. Well, if you're going from west to east, if you come on the High Line, you're going to come down through Spokane. If you come through the lower route, you're going to come through Spokane. All these rail lines are coming together. We are like the Silicon Valley. We are the place in the internet that's connecting everywhere. We are, it's kind of coming together here, whether it's Hilliard or downtown. So as much, those things were a kind of blight, but I find such beauty in them. I love that I can go for a walk and still see that high train bridge going through town. I love that it still goes through downtown. My daughter was married at the building Terrain is in, the old Cracker building there.
Yes.
And a train went by right in the middle of the ceremony. I was like, oh, that's so beautiful. I've grown up in the valley. I had train tracks on both sides. And so I do think it's this kind of lovely thing about our history, and it is, it is as every much this is a railroad town, and it's not the reason it's here. The river is the reason it's here, but it's the reason it became a city. It's the reason we're not, Malden or Rosalia or something, was because the railroad came through. All that wealth, gets congregated in this place. And I as far as a walking tour, someone else might have to organize that. Oh, and one more thing about Expo 74 and the Wobblies. So there's an old singer named Utah Phillips who was a modern day Wobbly and singer. And during Expo, he lived in Spokane. There's a great version of Hallelujah, I'm a Bum. You should look for it on the internet, that he sings, which comes from the book, that song, in which he talks about living in Spokane. And he mentions Kaiser. He says, he tells the story. He says, I'm in the middle of the song, he says, I'm on my front porch and all my neighbors want me to get a job. And one of them says, hey, buddy, why don't you get a job? And he says, and me being a practitioner of the Socratic method answers, why? And he says, well, because then you can make some money. And me, pressing on in that manner, says, why? And he says, well, then, eventually you'll make so much money you won't have to work another day in your life. And I say, what do you think I'm doing now? So anyway, Utah Phillips was a kind of modern day Rye or Gig who in the counterculture of the 1960s and 70s ended up hosting the folk exhibit at Expo 74. And then went on to kind of play music all around, playing these old Wobbly songs. So if you get a second, Google Utah Phillips and that song Hallelujah, I'm a Bum. And there are two versions, and one of them he talks a lot about Spokane. So
thank you. I will.
Yeah, but thank you all.
I have a joke for you real quick, and we'll send you off, Jess. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
1974, it's the fair, and I used to work downtown, and I'd wander about, and these wonderful, sweet people from Japan accosted me on the Howard Street Bridge, and very kindly asked me how we got the river to flow down through Expo 74. So I leave that.
Well, and since they haven't called, I'll end with my favorite Expo story. I was 8 years old, and all I wanted to do was go on a roller coaster. I'd never been on a roller coaster, and we were living up in Springdale on my grandpa's farm at the time. And so my dad said, all right, well, when we go to Expo, you can go on the roller coaster. I was so excited. And so we stood in line. I stood in line with my sister, and they put us in, and they lowered the bar. And I'd never been on a roller coaster, but I'd seen on the Brady Bunch that you raise your arms. So I put my arms up, and it flew forward, and I smashed my face and gushing. And they stopped it after about 4 feet. The thing got me off and said to my parents, slunk back. And I think sometimes I get my darts of humor from my dad, because with acting, he just said, how was it? So, which I love.
All 4 feet.
Yeah. All right, I should go. Thanks, everyone. It's great seeing you.
Thank you.
Thanks for
Thank
reading.
you.
Yeah, take care.
Thank you all for being here. This was fun. We can.
Great, thank you for organizing it.
It was wonderful.
Yes.
Linda.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Amazing.
Been
I
great.
had
Absolutely.
about 100 questions I wanted to ask him, but I knew there wasn't time. So
Yeah.
Right.
Too many questions, not enough time.
But
That,
it was
that,
wonderful.
that
I
Sally
have a
sure was vocal on the
suggestion.
whole thing.
that house that the sheriff, that the police chief was shot in on Cinto.
Yes.
I worked in West Central for an attorney, and the house that he had his office in was literally kitty corner around the block from that address.
oh, wow.
Actually, this book is the same period. I just finished it before this. It's a fishing, logging time and union organizing in Portland, Seattle, and the coastal area. So if anybody's interested in that same period, same issues, but in logging and fishing and that, get Deep River.
Thank you, Janet.
And then I got the Big Trouble that he talked about.
Yes.
It's a pretty thick book. It's basically the Coeur d'Alene mine battles and the aftermath of that. Clarence Darrow and lots of bigwigs dealing with that. I was trying to read it alongside and trying to get more information about that era.
Very good.
Well,
What a wild town we live in.
no kidding, no kidding.
Excuse me, could you tell me who wrote that book, The Big Trouble you were talking about?
Yeah, it's J. Anthony Lucas. He won the Pulitzer Prize for another novel, Common Ground. Subtitle: A murder in a small western town sets off a struggle for the soul of America.
Thank you.
I just realized I don't think I asked Sally for a comment or question before. I didn't mean to skip you, Sally. I'm so sorry.
That's fine. Probably the comment that I would have made is that I appreciated how Rye was protected throughout the book, because I found myself feeling anxious for him. And I was just really grateful that he was so protected, and by, some pretty unusual protectors. And I appreciated Jess as a writer not messing with us. I remember reading John Nichols novels, and I always felt like he was hostile towards the reader because he would get you attached to someone and then knock them off.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Well, I will pass that on to Jess.
Did anybody find the flaw in the book?
A flaw.
There's one minor flaw. Yes, page 263. Ursula talks to Edith at the top of the page, and then she, instead of thanking Edith, she thanks herself.
Oh, but
I
No,
can't
that
remember
was
that. I
dealt
almost
with
thought,
later on in that page. What you're calling a flaw was dealt with later on by Rye. He commented on it,
Oh, okay.
I think.
Well, yeah, they're both called Ursula.
yeah, I think she was
Because I
acknowledging
think-
hers.
I think that Edith, the woman that is referred to as Edith, was the original Ursula.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay,
Oh,
so
because
my
they're both-
mistake.
They were both Ursulas. Okay. That makes sense.
But that was close reading. Good.
Not close enough.
Yeah, I really thought I was in for more of a political novel, but what I really loved about it is that he had that backdrop, but he had such a dynamic interrelationship among all of the people. And it's there wasn't any exclusions, kind of like a little bit what you said, Sally, that everybody was around, and some like early were terrible, but there was both that protection and that interaction. The Italian family who kept him, that sort of boarding house thing. All of this was the kind of the message that I got from it is that we need each other. We've got to have each other at these different points and places in life that we travel through.
I certainly enjoyed the writing about the death of Dell. That was quite a murder.
That was horrible.
Yes.
But he was the horrible character too. Ugh.
It
I'm
was
so
kind of
Yeah.
curious that he could pull it off the way he did. It's like, oh,
I'm still not convinced that early died, because when I finished the book about 10 or 10:30 last night, I kept expecting him to appear, his face to appear in my front window or something.
Well, yeah.
When Maureen, you say it's surprising he could pull that off, and yet I can imagine walking with someone and saying COVID, and they would scout.
that's sad, but unfortunately, I get your point. Yeah.
Well, the consumption was the COVID of the day in some way.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, they could have said Spanish flu. I mean,
Not that, but 10 years later for certain.
well, I hope they do film it, and they film it in Spokane. That's the one thing.
Mhm.
'Cause it's very much about Spokane.
Yes, it is.
Well, and that reminds me of boat, and there's been so much push to do Boys in the Boat, but that's one of the questions, would it be, so it's never been filmed that I remember, has it?
I'm sorry, what was that?
Boys in the Boat?
Oh, Boys in
think
the
so, Leanne.
Boat, right.
No, but Seattle has had quite a press to have that filmed. And again, where is it you're going to pay people to be to do has been quite an issue. Anyway.
I'm thinking of Sue's thing, remember Conan Doyle, his writers were all upset when he killed off Sherlock Holmes. So then, remember, fell over the falls with Moriarty? And then he brings him back to life. So,
Right.
Spokane Falls.
True.
We need to get to go out for lunch again.
I know.
Yes.
So sad.
So what's our next book? I haven't listed, but I don't have the book yet.
The Night
The Night Portrait. Yay, I've read it.
Oh, yes.
Good. Yes, I'm looking forward to those two time periods, and it's interesting, 1492 and 1942.
Yes, Leanne.
Play.
Mhm. I had to gobble it up. I couldn't wait.
Well, it's fun too, because it talks about Leonardo da Vinci's painting, but also the Monument Men. So
Yes.
we've read those two books, and it's just going to be fun to see how this all works out.
Yeah. Marge, I have to give you kudos, Marge, because you had the winning background.
You really do, Marge.
I suddenly looked at all those books and I thought, oh yeah, that was smart. Good job.
And let's not forget that in April, we have Ben Goldfarb with us to discuss his book, Eager. So that's another one to look forward to.
Really?
Oh, okay.
You're over the top, Linda. You're over the top, man.
Lucky us.
Well, it was wonderful. Does anybody have anything else they want to share before we say bye-bye for this month?
I just want to thank you again, Linda. That was a real treat getting Jess
Yes.
Walter.
He's
Yeah.
such a
That
sweetheart.
was really nice.
He loves writing, and he also loves that he can, hear what people think of his books, I think. So this was fun for him too, I'm sure.
Good.
Bruce, another hour.
Okay.
Well,
Au revoir.
See you next
Thank
month.
you. Bye-bye,
Okay.
y'all.
Bye,
Bye.
guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, Jack.
Bye-bye.